Jack Whitman sits in his 50th floor office at Whitman Tower, scanning a quarterly report when his phone buzzes. His mother's name appears for the third time today. He finally answers, knowing what's coming. "Jack, this has gone on long enough," Elizabeth Whitman says firmly. "The Prescott's charity gala is next weekend. Caroline will be there. She's perfect for you, Harvard-educated, proper family background." Jack stares at the Manhattan skyline through his floor-to-ceiling windows. His mother's matchmaking attempts are becoming more frequent, more insistent. The board members have been dropping hints about stability, about the importance of a proper family image for the company's future. "Mother, I'm running a billion-dollar company. I don't need you arranging my personal life," he responds, but his voice lacks conviction. At 38, he knows the pressure will only increase. The board members are talking, "Jack. A stable marriage would strengthen your position." Elizabeth's words carry weight, as they always do. Jack agrees to attend the dinner, if only to stop the constant calls. Across town, Ruth Carter stands in her apartment, holding a weathered photograph. It shows her younger self in a maid's uniform, standing before the Whitman mansion. 8 years have passed since that rainy night when security escorted her out. "Pack your things and leave," he'd said, not even looking at her. Ruth is no longer that naive 22-year-old. She's rebuilt herself, learned to navigate the upper echelons of society. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual fundraiser provides her first opportunity to cross paths with Jack again. She arrives wearing an elegant black evening gown, her presence refined and confident. No one would recognize the former maid in this sophisticated businesswoman. The event buzzes with New York's elite. Jack mingles with board members, his attention caught by a familiar laugh. Something about the woman across the room triggers a memory, but he can't place it. Ruth notices his glance and turns away, a slight smile playing on her lips. She's worked too hard for this moment to rush it. The tension between them fills the room, though Jack remains unaware of her true identity. Ruth observes him from behind her champagne glass, noting how little he's changed, still commanding attention, still carrying himself with that mix of authority and charm that once captivated her. Ruth watches Jack work the room, remembering how he used to move through the mansion's halls with that same confident stride. She's studied him for months now, learning his habits, his social circles. The young maid who once cleaned his home has become an expert in his world. A waiter passes with champagne, and Ruth takes a glass, using it to hide her face when Jack glances her way again. Her heart pounds, but her hand remains steady. Years of preparation have led to this moment. She's no longer the vulnerable girl he dismissed, she's become someone who belongs in his social sphere. "Mr. Whitman," a board member calls out, drawing Jack into a conversation about merger possibilities. Ruth edges closer, pretending to admire a nearby sculpture. She can hear his voice now, deeper than she remembers, discussing business with the same passion he once reserved for their private moments. Jack feels distracted throughout the evening. Something about that woman in black keeps drawing his attention, like a half-remembered dream. He excuses himself from yet another conversation about potential marriage candidates and heads toward the bar. Ruth times her movement perfectly, allowing their paths to cross. They brush shoulders. "I apologize," Jack says automatically, catching a hint of a familiar scent. Ruth murmurs a polite acceptance and moves past him, knowing the brief contact will gnaw at his memory. She's changed enough to be unrecognizable, but kept just enough of her old self to plant seeds of recognition. Elizabeth Whitman appears at her son's side, noting his distraction. "Caroline is waiting to speak with you," she reminds him. Jack nods absently, his eyes still searching the crowd for the mysterious woman. Ruth uses this moment to position herself within earshot of their conversation. "The Prescotts are expecting you for dinner next weekend," Elizabeth continues. "It's time you took your position in society seriously." Ruth listens as Jack agrees half-heartedly to his mother's demands, remembering how easily he once bowed to family pressure. The evening draws to a close, and Ruth makes her exit before Jack can get a clearer look at her face. She's accomplished what she came for, she's no longer just a ghost from his past. She's become a presence in his world, one that will slowly force him to confront what he did. In her car heading home, Ruth touches her stomach reflexively, remembering the day she tried to tell him about the pregnancy. Tomorrow, their son Marcus will ask about his father again, and Ruth will give her usual careful answers. But soon, she thinks, very soon, all the questions will be answered. Jack returns to his penthouse that night, troubled by a nagging feeling he can't shake. He pours himself a scotch and loosens his tie, replaying the evening in his mind. That woman, something about her. He dismisses the thought. He has more pressing concerns: his mother's matchmaking, the board's expectations, the endless responsibilities of running Whitman Enterprises. But as he stands at his window overlooking the city, the ghost of a memory tugs at him. A rainy night, a tearful face, words he spoke in anger and fear. He pushes the thought away, just as he has for 8 years, unaware that his past is about to demand his full attention. Lisa Blackwood, a prominent art gallery owner, notices Ruth's calculated movements at the charity event. During the following week's gallery opening, she approaches Ruth directly, intrigued by her careful observations of Jack Whitman. "You watch him like someone who knows all his tells," Lisa comments, standing beside Ruth at the wine bar. "That's rare in our circle, most people only see what he wants them to see." Ruth maintains her composure, but recognizes an opportunity when it presents itself. "Perhaps I'm just interested in successful businessmen," Ruth replies smoothly, but Lisa's knowing smile suggests she sees more. They move to a quieter corner, where Lisa reveals her own complicated history with the Whitman family. Her father had once been Jack's father's business partner, before a mysterious falling out. Jack arrives at the gallery opening later that evening, his presence mandatory as a major patron of the arts. He notices the same woman from the museum event, now deep in conversation with Lisa Blackwood. Something about their familiarity sets off warning bells. "Lisa," he greets, approaching their corner. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." His eyes drift to Ruth, who meets his gaze with practiced indifference. Up close, the nagging feeling of recognition grows stronger. "Jack, meet Rachel Winston," Lisa introduces, using the name Ruth now goes by. She's recently moved back to New York after years abroad. The lie rolls smoothly off Lisa's tongue, they've rehearsed this moment. Ruth extends her hand, maintaining just enough eye contact to seem polite but not familiar. Jack's hand closes around hers, and for a moment, time seems to freeze. She can see him struggling with the ghost of recognition, but the expensive clothes, sophisticated manner, and carefully crafted backstory keep him from making the connection. "Welcome back to New York," he says, his tone suggesting he's trying to place her. "Have we met before?" "I doubt it," Ruth responds with a slight smile. "I've been in Europe for the past 8 years." The timeline isn't accidental, it matches exactly when she left his house, but he doesn't make the connection. Lisa watches their interaction with keen interest, already forming plans of her own. She steers the conversation toward business opportunities, knowing Jack's weakness for potential investments. Ruth plays her part perfectly, demonstrating knowledge of markets and trends that captures Jack's attention. As the evening progresses, Jack finds himself repeatedly drawn back to their corner. Ruth maintains a careful distance, but ensures she remains intriguing, offering insights into business matters that pique his interest, demonstrating an understanding of his world that feels somehow personal. Elizabeth Whitman arrives later, immediately noticing her son's unusual interest in the mysterious woman. She approaches Lisa privately, seeking information about the newcomer. Lisa provides the carefully constructed background story, watching as Elizabeth's social radar tries to place this new player in their world. Ruth observes the interaction between mother and son, noting how Elizabeth still controls Jack's social movements. She remembers hiding in the kitchen, listening to similar conversations years ago. But now she's not hiding, she's orchestrating. At evening's end, Ruth has accomplished her goal, establishing herself as a legitimate presence in Jack's social circle. Lisa has proven herself an invaluable ally, opening doors that would have taken months to access otherwise. As Jack drives home, he finds himself thinking about Rachel Winston, troubled by something he can't quite place. Her presence feels both new and familiar, like a song he once knew but can't quite remember. He makes a mental note to look into her background, unaware that every detail has been carefully crafted to withstand scrutiny. In his private office the next morning, Jack begins digging into Rachel Winston's background. Something about her keeps nagging at him, like a word on the tip of his tongue. His assistant brings him a detailed report: education at Oxford, successful business ventures in Europe, all perfectly documented. Too perfect, perhaps. "Your mother called again," his assistant mentions. "She's having lunch with Lisa Blackwood and the new woman, Rachel Winston." Jack's head snaps up at this information. His mother, usually so selective about her social circle, is moving unusually fast to welcome this stranger. Meanwhile, Ruth sits across from Elizabeth Whitman at an exclusive restaurant, maintaining her composure as the woman who once treated her like a servant now treats her as a peer. Lisa smoothly guides the conversation, building Ruth's credibility with each carefully planned revelation about her fabricated past. Mr. Harrison on line 1, Jack's assistant interrupts his research. He says it's about Howard Whitman's old will. Jack freezes, his father's name still carries weight, even years after his death. The elderly lawyer sounds troubled. Jack, I've been organizing old files, Harrison begins. There's something you should know about a codicil your father added to his will shortly before his death. It mentions provisions for unexpected heirs. Ruth receives a similar call later that day. Harrison's law firm has been searching for her, following old threads. Her hands shake as she listens to the lawyer explain that Howard Whitman had known about her pregnancy, had made provisions that Jack's mother had suppressed. Jack spends the afternoon in his father's old study, now just discovering hidden correspondence between his father and Harrison. Howard had suspected Jack's mother was intercepting communications, had planned contingencies. Among the papers, Jack finds a photo that makes his blood run cold, a much younger Ruth, standing in their house. The memories flood back. Not of Rachel Winston, but of Ruth Carter. The maid. The woman he'd sent away. The woman who had tried to tell him something important that rainy night. Jack sits heavily in his father's chair, the weight of his past decisions crushing down on him. Ruth meets with Harrison privately, learning the full scope of Howard's knowledge. He wanted to protect you, the lawyer explains. He knew his wife would try to prevent any claim, so he created a trust that would only be revealed under specific circumstances. Working late that night, Jack discovers more. His father had been investigating Elizabeth's manipulation of the family's affairs, had been planning to confront her about multiple instances of interference. His death had come before he could act. Ruth returns home to find Marcus working on homework. Her son, their son, looks up with those eyes so like his father's. "Mom, I found this while cleaning," he says, holding up an old newspaper clipping about Jack. Ruth's heart stops, seeing her carefully constructed plans threatening to unravel. Lisa calls Ruth with urgent news. Elizabeth has begun her own investigation into Rachel Winston's background. They need to move faster than planned. But Ruth hesitates, the weight of Howard's posthumous support changing her perspective on the situation. Jack stares at the old photograph of Ruth, remembering her last words to him, "You'll regret not listening to me." She had been right. His father had known something Jack had been too arrogant to see. Now, watching Rachel Winston move through his social circle, pieces begin falling into place. The stage is set for confrontation. Ruth's carefully planned revenge now complicated by the revelation of Howard's support. Jack's growing suspicions fueled by his father's hidden messages. And Elizabeth, sensing threats to her control, preparing her own countermoves. Ruth and Lisa meet in a quiet cafe far from their usual social haunts. The morning light casts long shadows across their table as they discuss the increasingly complicated situation. "Howard's will changes everything," Ruth admits, stirring her untouched coffee. "I came for revenge, but now you realize Jack might not have been the only one manipulated," Lisa finishes. She slides a folder across the table containing more documents from Harrison's investigation. Elizabeth Whitman has controlled this family's narrative for decades. Even Howard was fighting against her influence. Across town, Jack cancels his morning meetings, consumed by his research into the past. His mother's carefully orchestrated life choices for him, from his college major to his marriage prospects, take on a sinister cast in light of his father's hidden documents. The photograph of Ruth still sits on his desk, a reminder of his greatest regret. "The Prescott dinner is tonight," Elizabeth reminds him over the phone. "Caroline will be expecting you." Jack clutches the receiver, feeling the familiar pressure to comply. But now he recognizes it for what it is, manipulation. "I won't be attending," he says firmly. The silence on the other end is deafening. "Jack," Elizabeth's voice turns cold, "the board meeting is next week. The Prescott merger could secure your position. Without their support." Ruth faces her own crisis at home. Marcus has discovered more than just newspaper clippings. He's found old letters Ruth wrote to Jack but never sent, detailing her pregnancy and her feelings of betrayal. "Why didn't you ever mail these?" he asks, his teenage face a mirror of his father's questioning look. Lisa arranges another social event, this time a private dinner party. Ruth arrives knowing that both Jack and Elizabeth will attend. The stakes have risen. Elizabeth's investigation into Rachel Winston's background is getting closer to uncovering discrepancies. Jack enters the dinner party, his mind racing with questions. He watches Rachel Winston, or Ruth Carter, as he now suspects, navigate the room with practiced ease. The sight fills him with a mixture of admiration and shame. She's transformed herself into everything his mother values, using Elizabeth's own prejudices against her. Elizabeth corners Ruth near the wine service. "I've been looking into your time in Europe," she says smoothly. Fascinating how little documentation exists before 8 years ago. Ruth maintains her composure, but inside her heart pounds. The confrontation she's planned for months is approaching faster than anticipated. Later that evening, Jack overhears Lisa and Ruth talking in hushed tones. "Marcus needs to know the truth," Lisa insists. The name strikes Jack like a physical blow. Marcus, could it be? Ruth returns home exhausted, only to find Marcus waiting up. "Mom, who is Jack Whitman?" he asks directly. "And why do you have a file full of information about him?" The careful walls between her past and present begin to crumble. Jack spends the night reviewing security footage from recent events, watching Rachel Winston's movements with new understanding. Every gesture, every careful interaction suddenly makes sense. She's not just someone who reminds him of Ruth, she is Ruth, orchestrating an elaborate plan. Elizabeth, sensing her control slipping, makes a decisive move. She leaks information to the press about investigation into Rachel Winston's background, hoping to force her out of their social circle before she can cause more disruption. The morning papers carry subtle hints about questions regarding Rachel Winston's credentials. Ruth sees the articles and realizes time is running out. She meets with Harrison, who confirms her fears. Elizabeth is close to discovering the truth. "You need to act now," Lisa advises during an urgent phone call. Before Elizabeth destroys everything, just like she did 8 years ago. Ruth looks at the trust documents Howard left, then at a recent photo of Marcus. The time for careful planning is over. The boardroom at Whitman Enterprises sits empty except for Jack and Ruth, facing each other across the polished mahogany table. She's arranged this meeting through Lisa's connections, knowing it's time to drop the Rachel Winston facade. "You've known for a while now, haven't you?" Ruth asks, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Jack doesn't answer immediately, studying the woman before him, so different from the maid he once dismissed, yet unmistakably the same person. Since the gallery opening, he admits. "Not clearly at first, but something about you. When did you become so good at playing this game?" His tone carries a mix of admiration and wariness. "When you forced me to," Ruth responds simply. Before Jack can reply, his assistant interrupts, "There's an urgent situation developing." Photos of Ruth as Rachel Winston have been leaked to several news outlets, alongside her old employment records from the Whitman household. Elizabeth moves quickly, arranging an emergency board meeting. "We need to address this situation immediately," she insists, her perfectly manicured hands arranging documents that paint Ruth as a threatening presence. This woman is clearly attempting some sort of con. The social event that evening becomes a battlefield. Ruth arrives knowing her cover is blown, but she's prepared. Marcus stands beside her, attending his first high society function. The resemblance to Jack is unmistakable. Jack enters the room and stops dead. The boy standing next to Ruth might as well be a younger version of himself. Conversations quiet as people notice his reaction. Elizabeth, seeing her grandson for the first time, drops her champagne glass. The shattering crystal breaks the silence. "I'd like you to meet Marcus," Ruth announces clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Your grandson, Elizabeth. Your son, Jack." The calculated public revelation sends shockwaves through the gathered crowd. Marcus, well prepared by Ruth for this moment, maintains perfect composure. He meets his father's stunned gaze with a mixture of curiosity and challenge. Jack sees his own expressions, his own mannerisms, reflected in this teenager he never knew existed. Elizabeth recovers quickly, approaching with a warm smile that doesn't reach her eyes. "This is hardly the venue for such claims," she says smoothly. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately. Like we discussed it privately 8 years ago." Ruth counters. When you intercepted my letters to Jack. When you arranged for my immediate dismissal. The gathered crowd hangs on every word, hungry for scandal. Jack watches the interplay between his mother and Ruth, seeing the years of manipulation from both sides with new clarity. His son, he has a son, stands in the middle of it all, a living testament to his greatest mistake. Lisa appears at Ruth's side, providing silent support. She hands Jack a folder containing copies of his father's suppressed will, the trust documents, and evidence of Elizabeth's interference. His mother's face pales as she recognizes the papers. A reporter who had been quietly covering the event approaches, sensing a story. Elizabeth moves to intercept, but Marcus speaks first. "I'd be interested in hearing why my grandmother didn't want my father to know I existed," he says clearly, displaying the same commanding presence that made Jack a powerful CEO. The power dynamics shift visibly. Elizabeth's carefully maintained social facade cracks as she realizes she's lost control of the narrative. Jack, torn between shock, anger, and an overwhelming sense of loss, watches his perfectly ordered world unravel. The morning papers explode with headlines: Whitman heir revealed, hidden son returns to empire, family scandal rocks New York elite. Jack sits in his office, surrounded by newspapers, watching his carefully maintained public image crumble. His phone hasn't stopped ringing. Board members demand explanations, shareholders want reassurance, and reporters seek comments. Elizabeth has gone silent, the first time in Jack's life his mother hasn't immediately taken control of a crisis. The Prescotts have withdrawn from merger talks, his assistant reports. The news should devastate him, but Jack feels strangely liberated. He looks at a new photo on his desk, one snapped by a reporter last night, showing Marcus standing proudly beside Ruth. His son. Ruth faces her own bombardment. Reporters camp outside her apartment, forcing her and Marcus to temporarily relocate to Lisa's townhouse. "This isn't exactly how I planned it," she admits to Lisa over morning coffee, watching Marcus handle the situation with surprising grace. Elizabeth finally emerges from her silence, calling an emergency family meeting at the Whitman mansion. Ruth arrives with Marcus, entering through the front door this time, not the service entrance. The symbolism isn't lost on anyone. "We can control this narrative," Elizabeth begins, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "A story about family reconciliation, about second chances dash." "No more controlling the narrative," Jack interrupts, surprising everyone. "No more manipulation. It's time for the truth." He turns to Marcus. "Starting with an apology to my son." But before he can continue, Ruth produces a thick folder. "Before we discuss apologies," she says, "let's talk about these." She spreads out documents detailing years of Elizabeth's interference, not just with Ruth, but with numerous aspects of Jack's life. Elizabeth's perfect composure finally breaks. "Everything I did was to protect this family's position," she insists. "The right schools, the right connections, the right marriages. Do you think the Whitman empire was built on letting emotions rule decisions?" "It was built on lies," Marcus speaks up, his young voice carrying the weight of maturity beyond his years. "I've spent my whole life wondering about my father, while you spent yours controlling him." Jack stares at his son, hearing the echo of his own suppressed rebellions. He sees now how his mother's manipulation shaped every major decision in his life, including the terrible night when he sent Ruth away. The press conference scheduled for that afternoon looms over them. Elizabeth insists on presenting a united front, but Jack has other plans. He meets privately with Ruth and Marcus beforehand, in his father's old study. "I want to tell the truth," he says simply. "All of it. About mother's manipulation, about my cowardice, about how I failed both of you." Ruth watches him carefully, seeing real change in the men who once dismissed her so easily. Marcus, displaying wisdom beyond his years, asks the question that changes everything: and what happens after the truth comes out? What kind of family do we become then? The press conference begins. Cameras flash as Jack approaches the podium, Ruth and Marcus nearby. Elizabeth sits in the front row, her face a mask of practiced calm. But as Jack begins to speak, deviating from her carefully prepared statement, that mask starts to crack. Just before Jack can reveal everything at the press conference, a journalist raises his hand. "Ms. Carter, would you care to comment on your time in Chicago?" The question catches Ruth off guard. Her carefully constructed narrative has a gap: 1 year in Chicago she's never discussed, even with Lisa. Jack pauses at the podium, noticing Ruth's slight flinch. The journalist continues, sources suggest you were involved in a similar situation with the Henderson family. The accusation hangs in the air that Ruth might be a professional con artist targeting wealthy families. Elizabeth's face shows a glimmer of triumph. Of course she'd hired private investigators. Of course they'd found the one piece of Ruth's past she'd tried to bury. Marcus looks at his mother, confusion evident in his eyes. We need to postpone, Lisa whispers urgently to Ruth. But Ruth stands, approaching the podium. Yes, I was in Chicago, she says clearly. Working as a housekeeper for the Hendersons. Just like I worked for the Whitmans. The difference is, Mr. Henderson actually listened when his housekeeper warned him about his wife's embezzlement. Jack's head snaps up. The memory surfaces. Ruth had tried to tell him something about the company finances the night he sent her away. Something about discrepancies she'd noticed while cleaning his office. Elizabeth's triumph fades. Ruth continues, I left Chicago because Mrs. Henderson threatened to destroy my reputation if I testified. I had a son to protect. But I kept the evidence. She opens her purse, removing a USB drive. Both from Chicago, and from Whitman Enterprises. Later that evening, Jack finds Ruth alone in his father's study. The press conference had been suspended amid the chaos of her revelation. You were trying to warn me, he says quietly. About Mother's financial manipulations. Not just about Marcus. Your father figured it out, Ruth replies. Those last few months, he was gathering evidence. The pregnancy, that was separate. I never meant to use that as leverage. But when I saw the financial documents while cleaning. Jack moves to his father's old desk, pulling out the files he's recently discovered. He was investigating her. That's why he added the codicil to his will. Not just for Marcus, but because he knew Mother would try to bury everything. Ruth watches Jack process this information. Marcus wasn't my weapon, Jack. He was my reason for coming back. The financial evidence, that was my insurance policy. A soft knock interrupts them. Marcus stands in the doorway, looking uncertain for the first time since this all began. Mom. Dad. There's something I need to ask. They spend the next hours talking, really talking. About the past, about Elizabeth's manipulations, about Ruth's reasons for returning. Marcus listens, sometimes angry, sometimes understanding, asking questions that force both his parents to confront uncomfortable truths. I didn't just come back for revenge, Ruth finally admits. I came back because Marcus deserves to know his father. And because your father deserved to have the truth come out. Jack looks at his son, seeing the years he's missed reflected in every expression. I want to know everything, he says. Not just about the financial misconduct. About you, Marcus. About your life. If you'll let me. The rescheduled press conference takes place 2 days later, but everything has changed. Jack stands at the podium with a different kind of confidence, not the manufactured poise his mother instilled, but something authentic. 8 years ago, I made a series of mistakes, he begins. The first was trusting others to make my decisions. The second was turning away from the truth when it was presented to me. Elizabeth shifts uncomfortably in her seat as cameras turn toward her. Ruth and Marcus sit in the front row, beside Lisa. The evidence of Elizabeth's financial misconduct sits in a sealed envelope, ready to be handed to the proper authorities. But first, there's another truth to address. I'd like to officially acknowledge Marcus Carter Whitman as my son, Jack announces. The reporters burst into questions, but Jack raises his hand. And I'd like to acknowledge something else, the systematic suppression of information that kept me from knowing him. Elizabeth stands abruptly, moving toward the podium, but Jack continues. My father, Howard Whitman, discovered irregularities in both our family and business dealings. He tried to protect those who would expose the truth. He failed, but his efforts did not go to waste. The cameras catch Elizabeth's face as it transitions from controlled calm to barely contained panic. She knows what's coming next. Financial documents showing years of manipulation and misappropriation have been turned over to the SEC, Jack states. I take full responsibility for not seeing it sooner. For not listening to those who tried to warn me. Ruth watches as Jack's words land like precise strikes, dismantling the careful facade of the Whitman family. But instead of satisfaction, she feels a complex mix of emotions. This isn't the revenge she planned, it's something more meaningful. Marcus stands suddenly, walking to join his father at the podium. The gesture wasn't planned, but it feels right. Jack puts his hand on his son's shoulder, and the photographers capture the moment, a turning point in the Whitman legacy. Elizabeth makes one last attempt to salvage the situation, approaching the podium with her practiced social smile. Perhaps we should discuss family matters in private. No, Mother, Jack interrupts firmly. No more private discussions. No more manipulations. The truth comes out today, all of it. The press conference becomes a watershed moment. Jack reveals everything: his relationship with Ruth, Elizabeth's interference, the suppressed evidence, the years of manipulation. But he also speaks about redemption, about the chance to build something new from the ashes of deceit. Afterward, in the quiet of Howard's study, Ruth, Jack, and Marcus sit together. The reporters have gone, Elizabeth has retreated to her private suite, and the immediate storm has passed. But the real work is just beginning. What happens now? Marcus asks, looking between his parents. The question hangs in the air, heavy with possibility and uncertainty. In the days following the press conference, the Whitman empire teeters on the edge of transformation. Jack spends long hours with the board, addressing the fallout from Elizabeth's financial manipulations. The company's stock fluctuates wildly as the market reacts to each new revelation. Ruth finds herself in an unexpected position. The woman who came seeking revenge now sits in meetings with corporate lawyers, helping to untangle years of financial deception. Her knowledge of the household's inner workings, combined with her years of careful documentation, proves invaluable. Marcus adapts to his new reality with remarkable resilience. He begins spending afternoons in his grandfather's study, reading Howard's old journals, discovering the grandfather he never knew. He was trying to protect all of us, he tells his parents one evening. Even before he knew about me. Elizabeth remains sequestered in her wing of the mansion, receiving visits only from her lawyers. The evidence against her is substantial, not just financial misconduct, but years of systematic manipulation that bordered on corporate espionage. Jack approaches Ruth one evening as she's preparing to leave the mansion. I had our lawyers draw up papers, he says, holding out a thick envelope. Full recognition of Marcus as my heir, financial support, everything you should have had 8 years ago. Ruth takes the envelope but doesn't open it. 8 years ago, this was all I wanted, she admits. Recognition, support, justice. Now. She looks toward Howard's study, where Marcus is still reading through his grandfather's papers. Now I want something different. The question of prosecution looms over everything. Elizabeth's crimes warrant serious charges, but they're also family matters. Marcus surprises everyone by asking to speak with his grandmother alone. The meeting between grandmother and grandson becomes a turning point. Marcus emerges with a perspective none of them expected. She's scared, he tells his parents. Not of jail, but of losing control. Of becoming irrelevant. Like she made mom feel. Like she made dad feel. Jack struggles with the weight of decision. His mother's actions deserve consequences, but prosecuting her would mean publicly dismantling his father's legacy. What would you do? He asks Ruth late one night in Howard's study. 8 years ago. I'd want her to suffer like I suffered, Ruth answers honestly. But now. I look at Marcus, at how he's handling all this, and I realize we have a chance to break the cycle. Not by punishing her, but by building something better. They work out a solution that feels both just and merciful. Elizabeth will step down from all company positions and relinquish control of her financial assets. She'll enter treatment for her controlling behaviors, and any return to family involvement will depend on her progress. Marcus shows wisdom beyond his years when he says, maybe the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. Maybe it's not becoming them. Jack begins the process of restructuring both the company and his life. The board, initially skeptical, comes to respect his newfound authenticity. The stock prices stabilize as transparency replaces manipulation. Ruth finds herself facing an unexpected choice. The papers Jack offered would give her everything she once wanted, but now she sees a different possibility, a chance to heal rather than triumph, to build rather than reclaim. Just as the Whitman family begins to find its new balance, Jack's closest friend and board member, Richard Sterling, requests an urgent private meeting. The revelation he brings threatens to shatter their newly formed peace. "I need to tell you something," Richard begins, his usual confidence replaced by visible unease. "It's about your father, and me." He pulls out an old photograph, one showing a much younger Howard Whitman with a woman who bears a striking resemblance to Richard. "I'm your half-brother, Jack," Richard reveals. "Howard was my father too." "Your mother?" Elizabeth knew. "She's been using this information to control my votes on the board for years." The revelation sends shockwaves through the family. Jack realizes that his father's hidden documents weren't just about Elizabeth's financial misconduct or Ruth's situation, they were about a larger pattern of secrets and suppressed truths. Ruth finds herself in an unexpected position of mediator. Having fought her way back into the Whitman world, she now understands better than anyone the complexity of family secrets. "Your father was trying to make things right," she tells both men. "That's what all the documentation was about, not just my story, not just the finances, but everything." Marcus, already grappling with his own place in the family, now has an uncle he never knew existed. Surprisingly, he's the first to bridge the gap. "So, does this mean I have cousins too?" he asks Richard, breaking the tension with his directness. The question of inheritance takes on new dimensions. Richard never wanted financial gain, he'd built his own successful career. What he wanted was acknowledgement, the same thing Ruth had sought for Marcus. Elizabeth, when confronted with this final revelation, breaks down completely. "Howard was going to leave me," she admits. Not just because of the financial manipulation, but because he'd decided to acknowledge Richard publicly. "I couldn't let that happen." Jack pieces together the full picture, his father's growing awareness of Elizabeth's manipulation, his attempts to protect Ruth and her unborn child, his plans to acknowledge Richard, all leading to a comprehensive restructuring of the Whitman legacy that was interrupted by his untimely death. He wasn't just leaving a fortune, Jack realizes. He was trying to leave us the truth. In the end, the notion of inheritance transforms. It becomes not just about money or power, but about legacy and truth. The Whitman empire restructures, with Jack and Richard working together to implement the transparency their father had envisioned. Ruth watches as her son finds his place in this expanded family. Marcus, rather than being diminished by these revelations, seems to grow stronger. He becomes a bridge between the family's past and its future, untainted by old resentments. The final scene unfolds in Howard's study. Jack, Ruth, Marcus, and Richard gather to read Howard's personal journal together. Its pages reveal a man who, in his final years, had tried to correct the course of his family's legacy. "Maybe this is what real inheritance looks like," Marcus observes, looking around at his assembled family. "Not just what we receive, but what we choose to do with it." The story ends not with the triumph of revenge or the simple resolution of conflict, but with the more complex victory of understanding and renewal. The shadows of the past don't disappear, but they lengthen into something that guides rather than haunts. Ruth and Jack, once separated by pride and manipulation, find themselves co-architects of a new family structure, one built on truth rather than appearance. And Marcus, the catalyst for all this change, becomes not just an heir to wealth, but a guardian of his family's renewed integrity. The end.